This monthly adventure of ours. Good, and the recording has started. So yeah, let's get underway. I know others will be joining as we progress through this. I'm Rob Schwartz, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the November Public Health Policy Rounds. These are rounds that we have every month during the academic year. If you have never joined us before, then please do let Sonia Johnson know, and she will put you on our mailing list. They are open to the general public health policy community. Anybody who's interested is welcome to join. And they also serve as a required course for the trainees in the collaborative specialization in public health policy. Today, we're going to be looking at a really hot topic. It would be even hotter if it weren't for COVID, I would say, but it also may be that COVID should be somewhat stimulating interest in this. Maybe Brian will have something to say about that during his talk. Before we get to it, I will start with the land acknowledgement. I know that Brian is joining us from Brazil, and so Brian, as I do this land acknowledgement, which is for where I'm sitting, which is in Toronto, near the University of Toronto, I'm sure you'll be thinking about the Indigenous peoples in the region where you're at, and I know that some of the other people on the line are also sitting in other places. So we would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Mississauga, the New Credit, First Nation, Anishinaabe, Wendat, Huron, Haudenosaunee Indigenous peoples on which the Dalla School of Public Health sits. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We'd also like to pay our respects to all of our ancestors and to our present elders. I'd like to pause for a moment just so that each of us can consider what that may mean for us personally on this day, November the 12th, day after Remembrance Day. I'm just going to pause for a moment. Great. So I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Brian Rush. Brian has worked for 40 years as a substance use and mental health researcher at CAMH. He is currently a scientist emeritus at CAMH. Brian is also a full professor at U of T in the Dalla School of Public Health and in psychiatry. And he holds a position as a collaborating scientist at the Homewood Research Institute. He's done a wide variety of work in population health, evaluating mental health and addiction treatment services and systems, including those focused on alternative and traditional medicine. Dr. Rush is currently the project lead for a multi-site study known as the Ayahuasca Treatment Outcome Project, or ATOP. He's also active in facilitating the collaboration among Canadian researchers, students, and policymakers interested in psychedelic science, including a traditional plant-based medicine. And I'm privileged to serve on a PhD supervisory committee, which Dr. Rush is the lead on. I'm going to introduce our two discussants also. For those of you who've never participated here, we have about 35 minutes for our keynote, and that's followed by 5 minutes each for a faculty discussant and for a trainee discussant. Our faculty discussant today is my close colleague, Dr. Pamela Kaufman. Pam is an assistant professor at U of T in the Dalla School of Public Health, and she is a scientist at the Ontario Tobacco Research Unit. Her research addresses physical and social environmental factors that affect the development and implementation of public health policies, their benefits and effects on and unintended consequences. Recent projects include physical and social exposure to smoking, vaping, and cannabis use in public spaces and multi-unit housing. She's also involved in the design and evaluation of policy, programs, and interventions at the local and provincial level, including for smoking and vaping cessation for youth and young adults, and also multi-province workplace smoking cessation piece. Just as a matter of curiosity, Pam's training was in landscape architecture. And so she brings a very different perspective to public health policy. She's one of the initial mentors in this training program, which started as a CIHR STIR project. I'm also delighted to introduce Divya Rajagopal Sarkar. Divya was so kind to step in at the next to last minute to take on this discussant role, as a couple of previous trainees were unable to step in at the last minute. Divya is a second-year student at the Monk School of Global Affairs, and she is one of our trainees in the collaborative specialization in public health policy. Interestingly, before she joined the Monk School, Divya was a health and pharmaceutical journalist with the Economic Times newspaper based out of Mumbai in India. Divya, I think you are the first of our trainees from the Monk School, and you're a pioneer because the Monk training program in global affairs is now becoming a participating program in the public health policy training program. So welcome all. I am going to keep quiet now. I'll just remind particularly our trainees that it's your job to comment and to ask questions, and each of you should be thinking of at least one question to ask during our Q&A. So get ready, Brian, for some tough questions. I'm joking.
I'm ready.
For some insightful questions. Over to you, Brian.
Okay, thanks so much, Rob, and I'm so pleased to be here today and supporting the work. As I mentioned, I see part of my role as kind of an old timer in a way to just keep things moving along in the field and stimulate things and share with students. So this is really nice to be invited, Rob. I really appreciate it. So I'm gonna do the share screen thing, and we already checked that out, so it works. And I will go on here. And I'm gonna go quickly through a few slides at the beginning just to make sure everybody gets kind of on the same page where this field is at. A few definitional things that are important for policy, and then end up pretty focused on the policy piece and hopefully set the stage for questions. Before I start, I want to thank you, Rob, for the land acknowledgement. I am in Brazil here with my family, and you know, the situation here in Brazil is not good for Indigenous peoples, and I've been invited in early December to the Amazon to visit an Indigenous community, and I'll carry that acknowledgement there with me. So thank you so much for that. So without further ado, here's the objectives for today. So I'm going to go really fast through this the synthesis of the research. Mostly I want to impress upon you how much we have, and while there's a lot, it's still pretty early stages, and which is totally relevant when we get to the policy questions. There is an important distinction that I'll make between quote unquote psychedelic-assisted therapy and the use of what are referred to often as entheogens. It's a particular class of psychedelics that we use that are used more in a ritualistic context. This distinction is really critical from the policy point of view, because most of the discussion currently is around, you know, psychedelic-assisted therapy, end of life, depression, alcohol, etc. Whereas many of the same substances are still being used in a ritualistic context, and it's not quite clear where they fit at the moment in the policy discussion. I'll bring you up to date on current processes around regulation, and highlight a few efforts, you know, bringing different people together. And then a slide that I hope will generate a few questions. I just brainstormed for myself what I thought were some facilitators and also challenges in moving this forward. And importantly, I want to highlight not only the clinical applications, but the public health considerations here, because they are also significant. And as I'm going through, you might want to keep in mind the whole trajectory that we went through around medical marijuana to legalization of recreational marijuana, because there's some parallels here. So psychedelics, and I'm making a distinction here between the next class of entheogens. So psychedelics are synthetic or chemically isolated psychoactive substances. They've got a long history, many uses. They're often referred to the classic psychedelics: psilocybin, LSD, peyote, ayahuasca. But then there's others that kind of fall into this class, although they're not kind of the same psychopharmacological family. There's a lot of similarity, but also diversity in the mechanisms. You can read at your leisure the whole psychobiology of this. Is really quite interesting. It is relevant from the policy point of view in terms of the impact of these substances on the brain and behavior, and especially when considering risk and safety and public health considerations. So I can't go too deep into this, but it's an important part of the story. So what are entheogens? Entheogens are often many of the same substances. They tend to be plant-based. Ayahuasca, for example, mushroom, peyote, probably the best examples. But what distinguishes them, and they are used historically in a ritualistic context. And in the current context here, we have some legalized licensed religions, the Santo Daime, which I'll explain in a moment, the Native American Church. But the point is they come with a long tradition. And from a policy point of view, some of these have already been legalized and regulated in Canada. The other below, many of you heard of the ayahuasca ceremony or peyote ceremonies, mushroom ceremonies and so on. These are all underground. And they vary a lot in who's running them, and people are kind of on their own to figure out safety, et cetera. So just keep in mind these two broad classes, and you'll see the research I summarized very quickly is mixed between these two different types of use. So a quick visual tour. Here's our LSD. MDMA, which I mentioned, not classic psychedelic, but generally falls into the category. Ketamine, which is legal. It's a legalized medication used for an anesthetic, but it's got a variety of purposes now. Psilocybin, both in natural form and synthetic. A slide like this is important because if you want to use for research, one would want to put it in some form that can be measured and condensed and analyzed for dosage. This is very difficult if you're using a traditional plant. Ayahuasca, which is a mixture of two different plants, contains DMT. I won't get into the pharmacology here, but it's really quite interesting. Either one of these substances on their own are inactive, but the combination is what stimulates the system. Peyote, which is legalized in the Native American Church. You see the slide at the bottom. DMT, which comes in many different forms and plants, but often used from this particular toad. The Sonora Desert in northern Mexico is famous for this. These animals, by the way, and many of these plants are also at risk of I won't say extinction, but there's major harvesting of these substances, including peyote. A lot of discussion around just protection of the environment, including these animals. Wachuma, people don't talk about too much, but it's a very powerful plant. Iboga and ibogaine comes from Africa. There's a long history of research in this in the opioid area. Yopo, and then I just want to acknowledge our own many Canadian non-psychedelic plants, but for Indigenous people, these are all part of the same family. So who's interested in these? Well, students of plants, and if you've not read Wade Davis's book, it's an amazing read. If you read it, you probably want to be him, as he had some amazing adventures discovering many of these plants, and also with his mentor, Dr. Schultes. And then many other people, students of the mind and the body, the spirit, culture. So this area of psychedelics in general, entheogens, is of interest to a wide range of scholars. And then, of course, we have Michael Pollan's book, which if you've not read anything yet, this is probably the place to start. He actually did a pretty nice job in bringing this out into the public attention. So the healing context, here's what we'd refer to as psychedelic-assisted therapy. It's getting most of the conversation from a policy point of view, typically done with two therapists and the person in a quiet room, music. The therapists, by the way, in their training have experience with the psychedelic medicine that they're going to work with.
Unknown caller.
And then there's a whole variety of these retreats, some underground, some not. In Europe, some of these retreats are now legalized. This is a typical shamanic context, often in the evening, but not always. And then this is a syncretic church. This is what I referred to earlier as the legalized religious use of ayahuasca. In this case, the church is probably in Brazil because it's big, but we now have five exemptions in Canada for the legal importation of ayahuasca, which contains DMT, which is a controlled substance for these contexts. And this is one example. This is where my own project started. It's a center 25, 30 years old in Peru, which is mixing ayahuasca and a wide variety of plant medicines for the treatment of addiction. So you can see there's a wide variety of contexts here. This makes it also confusing for policymakers because it's not all about this. This is what's bringing attention for end of life, depression, anxiety, substance use. This is the model under discussion for therapy. This confuses everyone. But anyway, and here I don't think I need to go too deep into the history. It has a long history. Interestingly enough, the Addiction Research Foundation, which was one of the forerunners to the current Center for Addiction and Mental Health, was pretty active at the time. Reg Smart, for example, was a colleague of mine and probably Rob's for years. And he did some lit reviews in this area that really impacted the US policy decision to basically shut down psychedelic research. So we have a history here. Just read for a moment what it means to be a Schedule I substance. Number one, it's considered as having a high potential for abuse. There's no currently accepted treatment application, and there's a lack of accepted safety. So the research underway is really intending to move these substances out of this Schedule I. Many people would say the research is ready based on these three criteria, but not everyone agrees, and policymakers have not quite got there yet. So why the resurgence of interest? I think I'm probably speaking to the converted here. You all know the global burden of illness around depression, anxiety, substance use. You mentioned COVID, Rob. I think that's interesting that I think there is a discussion about the need to open up more options for treatment and support for mental health and addictions. COVID has certainly impacted. We've got a lot of evidence around that. The treatment gap, we have a lot of countries around the world where this gap is huge, including here. We certainly need more tools, and the current evidence is quite promising, and many people could benefit, and we know a lot of people are using these substances. Are using these substances now. It's just waiting to bring my phone down. Sorry about that. Okay, so this is interesting. Look at the work underway. As of August this year, we've got 74 clinical trials approved, probably more already. And I just want you to take a quick look at the alcohol bar here, 12. That's a bit misleading because that includes alcohol, that includes tobacco, that includes opioids, that includes stimulants. So it's kind of a big package in there. So on balance, there's much less research that has been conducted and even still planned in the substance use area. This is an interesting one from a policy point of view because of the maybe still leftover stigma around using drugs to treat drugs, using drugs to treat other substance abuse. I often wondered about that. There's much less work. You can see the end of life work, et cetera, et cetera. And we've got a huge number of scoping reviews. Just out of interest, recently over the summer, I did a review on behalf of CIHR, I might add, of this whole area. And we ended up, after all the search terms and so on, just focused on the clinical work of 1,600 studies published since 1990. This is a massive body of research. That's not even including literally hundreds and hundreds done in the 60s and the 70s. And a lot of reviews, most in the 5 years. So the literature's really picked up very, very quickly. So what's the current evidence base? We got 35 minutes or so. So I synthesized down into the Brian Rush scoring system. You only really need to look at the top line, promising. We're a long way from the kind of evidence that is typically called upon for approving medicine, approving medication, phase 3, phase 4 type clinical trials. We're a long way from there. We tend to be a bit further behind in the substance use area. You see a few little highlights here. One interesting one was the review of the earlier research, like meta-analysis of some of the better controlled studies of LSD and alcohol use disorder back in the day turned out to be pretty positive, whereas most people look at that earlier research as well. It was really not all that well done. There were a few studies that were done pretty well. Psilocybin and tobacco is one of the areas that still stands out in the research from Matt Johnson and colleagues at Johns Hopkins. And I think I just go on. So here's an overview.
Sorry, what are 2 pluses versus 1 plus signify?
That's simply a Brian Rush kind of relative rating. So it's like the evidence is better. So if I was to say MDMA for alcohol, there's really only one kind of proof of concept study that basically showed safety. Whereas for LSD, we're looking at a meta-analysis of 5 or 6 really good controlled studies. So I think the main point is there's no 3 or 4 or 5 stars. So I was just trying to synthesize here so we wouldn't have to spend a whole lot of time on the research. But it's important. And I should also add that the consistency of the research is what people point to. It generally points to consistent positive work. There are often a meta-analysis of a small number of studies in 1 or 2 areas, let's say ketamine and alcohol, and the results might be, we're not so sure. But it's the overall body of evidence that people point to when they say it's positive. And look at the scope of the mental health work. It's really broad, and it even work in the area of autism. You had a study in schizophrenia, grief, et cetera. So there's just a lot of work underway. This slide back here is really only about 10 to 15 studies. Only about 10 to 15 studies. This slide here is many, many more. A lot of work on depression, a lot of work on ketamine, which by and large, overall is not all that positive, despite the fact ketamine clinics are opening up across the country. Ayahuasca, not too much, but again, in the general direction of. So the big highlights here are MDMA for PTSD. This is a direction that the government's likely to go to quickly, if and when it goes. And also psilocybin for depression and end of life. That's the takeaway from that slide. The research is not way out there positive, but there's just more of it, much more of it. So what have we learned from these naturalistic studies? We've got this interesting situation in Brazil where these religious organizations, churches, religions, have had legal use for now over 20, 30 years. And so there's a lot of good naturalistic work with long-term users, very low toxicity, no addiction potential, across the board in classic hallucinogens. It's a common finding, but often better health on several indicators. We had one small naturalistic outcome study in BC. Results were quite positive. And then we've got a lot of people going to these ayahuasca and peyote ceremonies that sets the stage for just observational work and contact, like qualitative kind of work. they generally are pointing to very positive kinds of perception. So not clinical trials, but this work here is building and accumulating and is still, I think, contributing to the overall body of knowledge. And then we have more and more community population health studies, and we'll see to what extent StatsCan starts to adapt their mental health surveys in Canada. I would recommend it simply as a surveillance objective, also to document any potential harms. But these studies, again, point generally towards positive outcomes, interestingly enough, including reduced suicidality, which draws a lot of attention to this field. And if you put all these data together in kind of different multivariate modeling, the use of psychedelics on its own, when controlled in various regression analyses and so on, but these are also cross-sectional, keep in mind, is not an independent risk factor. I put this slide up simply to point to the bottom point. Although there's all the neuroscience and all these psychological hypotheses, like what is mediating all these effects is also often a very powerful transcendental experience, peak experience, a spiritual experience. And I'll end up today posing a question for you that I just kind of struggle with a little bit, whether there might be any hesitation on the part of government to be approving medicine that is with this really strong link to religion and spirituality, given the historical separation of science and religion. And I think we have a lot of good reasons to do that, but this is starting to mix things up a little bit. I often wonder whether policymakers get a little bit confused about this, although remember they did approve for the Santo Daime churches, but that's for the church, that's not for medicine. So the current regulatory context, we have the Controlled Substance Act, which I mentioned, and then we have Section 56, which is really meant to be an exception to the Controlled Substance Act. So you can use this substance, which is normally out of grasp, out of reach, for the reasons I described, but it's if necessary for medical or scientific purpose, or quote unquote, otherwise in the public interest. So there's kind of a lot of slipperiness in here, room for government. And this can be for research, and that would include providing access, say, to psilocybin for training of therapists, or the religious use, which I mentioned. We have 5 exemptions now in Canada for the Santo Daime Church. Many exemptions all around the world, actually. It's a global spread of that religion. And then compassionate use, which has been primarily for end-of-life distress. There's another opportunity or a way in which there might be access to these substances, and that would be through the Section 2 of the Charter, which is the freedom of thought, freedom of expression part. And to my knowledge, this has not yet been litigated. There's another possibility. I'm not an insider here, but there's another option, another opportunity within the federal government anyway, to provide access through what's known as the Special Access Program. So a healthcare provider can recommend the use of a medication or a procedure when everything else has failed. And right now, these substances are not available through that program. But if they want to move past Section 56, then that's one other possibility. I mentioned to Rob earlier, just in getting set up for today, I participated in a conference that included a lawyer by the name of Paul Lewin, who has he supported me in helping prepare this slide. And his presentation is available online, and I can now provide that. He gives a really, really concise overview of these issues, especially related to the Charter and the freedoms we enjoy as Canadians. And it's pretty clear in his talk that that if someone really challenged under the Charter, that the end user is likely going to win. But right now the government uses 56 exemptions, so the Supreme Court hasn't been too keen on providing any other access. Well, you can apply to 56 exemption and you're good to go. So there's a lot in here, and I'm certainly not an expert or an insider in all of this, But there is a way to access these substances at the present time is primarily through 56. So who are the current actors here? There's a lot and it changes every day. So here's kind of the current research scene. We have MAPS Canada, which is connected to an international organization, basically of the US. And they've been very, very active in evaluating the use of MDMA particularly for PTSD. They've moved really far. There's a few sites here in Canada, McGill being one of them. And so there's a lot of work. So MAPS, interestingly enough, is not only supporting research, but they really advocate for much more open use of psychedelics in general. CIHR has an emerging interest. We're not sure when, but I think we can all expect a call for proposals relatively soon. That also means when it comes that there's been everything worked out with Health Canada for the exemptions for research. And look at the list of research centers. This is all developed over about the last year or two. We have the MAPS trials. We have a new center in Ottawa, which is closely connected to the Department of Religion. Queen's University is an emerging center. What's interesting there is Jane Philpott, who was the previous Minister of Health in Health Canada, is part of the emerging center at Queen's. That's pretty interesting. U of Toronto, the Department of Psychology, has had an interest in microdosing. We have a new center about 3-4 weeks old now, officially, at the University Health Network, funded through the Nikian Foundation. University of Alberta is an interesting one because it's in the Department of Pharmacy, and they are producing psilocybin and other substances for research. And the British Columbia Center on Substance Use has been active in this area for quite some time. So that's kind of the lay of the land in research. And it's significant how quickly it has grown. So then from a knowledge translation point of view, and I put Therapsil here, it's not exactly KT, but it supports access to people applying for end-of-life support. Therapsil will help because the exemption says, yes, you can use the substance, but you got to go find it on your own. It doesn't say where to get it, or doesn't say you can grow it or whatever. So they provide access. We have the Canadian Psychedelic Association, which is really interesting because it has drafted regulations for Health Canada, and it's referred to as MORA. And the draft kind of says, well, the healthcare provider could recommend this for you. The healthcare provider makes the application to the grower, if you will. They send it back, and it then goes to a clinic. So the patient never actually gets their hands on it, unlike cannabis, unlike the medical cannabis. So there's a lot of proposals how to make this safe, and also to somehow avoid kind of the black market, although I'm not sure they can really manage that given what's happened in the cannabis world. I sent around, Rob and colleagues sent around the paper in the Canadian Journal of Psychology that has set the stage for potentially a national advisory council. So a small group has declared their intention to form this advisory role for Health Canada. And I understand Health Canada is listening. We have an emerging research and policy network, about 30 or more researchers from across the country. Health Canada participates on that network. It's quite informal at present, but we'll see how that goes. And then we've got our own conference. I'm part of a planning committee coming up next May. We'd like to see you there. I'll put an advertisement at the end of the presentation. It will have a bit of a who's who for psychedelic science internationally. And there's these regional workshops. And then this is another interesting one. I could probably put 20, 30, 40 different entrepreneurial companies here. It was very interesting. I went to the opening of the UHN Psychedelic Research Center, and there was just a lot of what looks to me like startup type folks, people maybe who'd made money previously in the cannabis world, and we're here now looking for opportunity. And I'm not here to say there's not a role for industry. There's a huge role for industry. Like in any part of, the pharmaceutical industry. Somebody has to make it, somebody has to test it, somebody has to make sure it's safe and so on. But I just put three here that are of interest. One is Numinous, which is a company that's supporting the MAPS trials, which is, I think, a good thing. They're quality control. Field Trip Health, which is rapidly expanding in Canada and the US with ketamine clinics, but they're totally poised for psilocybin when the moment arrives. And then Diamond Therapeutics. Rob, do you remember a guy by the name of Ed Sellers? Do you remember Ed Sellers? Wow. He was the head of medicine in the Addiction Research Foundation. He's now consulting for Diamond Therapeutics to produce essentially non-psychedelic psilocybin. So it's essentially an antidepressant medication with no hallucinogenic properties because it's at such a low dose, but would be used potentially routinely as an antidepressant. So instead of Valium or whatever. So this is a very interesting development. And then there's all kinds, I don't know how many people working in the field, experts, psychedelic researchers, are also in a consultancy role for different startups and different companies. And for me, this is a little bit concerning, but it's, it is the way it is. So here's what I thought close to finish on and maybe stimulate some questions. So first on the facilitators, we have research-related facilitators here. Just as I mentioned, the general positive direction of the research, also reanalysis of the older work, generally positive, also more acceptance of mixed methods. And why that's important is because the clinical trials in this area are really complicated to interpret. I presented on the other side as the set and setting conundrum. And you're not just testing any old medication here where you can put it in a clinical trial and control out everything. And so the results are related to this medication, but not to other kind of contextual effects. These substances depend on context for their impact. So it makes the research quite complicated, and general acceptance of more qualitative mixed methods research is, I think, as a facilitator here. And then all these multiple stakeholder interests, including what I call inside support. I know there's people inside government that are really quite interested and supportive of this topic. So you're all the policy experts here, so you know yourselves how important some key individuals can be in a policy context. Somebody's really pushing and supporting something if they are in a position of authority. It can also go the other way around, where some people can really block progress. Some individuals can block progress. We have the national priority for mental health substance use, and I think COVID has in fact stimulated interest in this area. The increasing acceptance of harm reduction, as I mentioned, because maybe that's why we weren't doing so much work in the alcohol and drug area. And I think we kind of got over that, certainly in Canada, but not in the US. The US, by the way, NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, has just funded its first clinical trial in psychedelics since they shut the door a couple of decades ago. So that's an interesting sign coming from the US. The media interested has shifted quite a bit from, oh, look at all these dangerous substances and look at how many people are dying in the jungle, to really positive articles from many mainstream media, including, the Globe and Mail and many others, Harper, other like really solid, the New Yorker, like really solid kind of journals are generally giving a positive story. And then our work with Indigenous peoples, which I'll close on in a moment, from a truth and reconciliation point of view, we need to recognize that Indigenous peoples have a right to their medicines. This is founded in United Nations, not law, but policy coming from the United Nations, that as a traditional way of healing. There's a controversy here in Canada around that, because many of the traditional leaders here will say, well, that medicine's not from here, so it doesn't belong here. And so there's controversy even within Indigenous peoples around access to these substances. And that also bumps up into the colonialization and the impact of Christianity on our Indigenous peoples. Many of them would even look at a sweat lodge as demonic, let alone using a psychoactive substance. So here's our challenges. One, I think, is quite real at the moment, getting ahead of the research evidence. So everybody's ready to go. People want policy. People are looking for exemptions, but some people in pretty high positions are saying, hold on, we're not there yet. So there may be a sense of policymakers and the legislators wanting to get on with this, but the research not being ready. I mentioned the set and setting conundrum. Safety is important. By and large, these substances have been pretty well tested. Many of them go through this first safety assessment phase. A few acute effects. Some of the things that are identified as adverse consequences, at a point in time, people understand some of the challenges that they experienced during the experience actually benefit to them. For example, dealing with trauma, dealing with stored up memory, stuff that's not been dealt with. We do have a problem with dosage and content, especially for the natural substances, the entheogens, that you can't, people would say you shouldn't even put it in a pill, let alone try to do that. Balancing risk and benefit. This is a tricky one because the survey research generally points towards a balance, towards benefit. But did we really fully understand, for example, in cannabis and OxyContin, what the potential negative consequences might be from a public health perspective for legalizing psychedelics? I think we need to give this a lot of thought, a lot of thought. I could point to all kinds of data now about emergency and admissions to substance use disorders for cannabis use disorder. On balance, risk and benefit. I remember the conversations with Jürgen and Benedict Fischer and their recommendations from CAMH to government for legalization was really on balance, the benefits were greater than the risk. So I think we have to go through this very carefully for psychedelics. There may be leftover 60s stigma. I mentioned the stigma around drugs, and then the spirituality and science. So maybe that'll stimulate a few questions. I do want to just pause on that last point I made around what do we do with this spirituality? It's a powerful experience for a great many people. These are from either survey research or clinical trials where the mediating factor is often this peak experience of connectivity, quote unquote God experiences. And as a reminder, this touches on our Indigenous people and their rights to these medicines and their interpretation of healing and their interpretation of spirituality. So where will it fit in? I think it depends on the context. It depends on what people have in mind when they're developing policy. They may only have in mind this last little square down here, if you can see my pointer, but this stuff's not going away. This is here. There's ayahuasca ceremonies throughout Canada every weekend, throughout the world. We've got rich people going to retreat centers. We've got treatment centers, and we've got the Santo Daime and the Union Vegetal. So we've got a lot of other contexts here for regulation that I think kind of make things a little bit complicated at the moment. This is the safe route for policymakers, but it's not the only route. And then a last plug for our conference. You'll be getting, maybe you can help push out our call for abstracts. It's coming out within a few days. We're just getting the French translations done. And it's kind of a big deal. We were able to bring on CAMH, the Mental Health Commission of Canada, CCSA, like as co-sponsors for a conference on psychedelics here in Canada. So that's coming. So thank you. Thanks again for the invitation, Rob, and I look forward to all these great questions.
Thank you, Brian. I mean, this is clearly on the agenda. I mean, you've got the CCSA and CAMH and the foundation all sponsoring a conference on this. And so we're all reading about it. It seems every week there's something else in the mainstream media about it. And I find it really fascinating from a policy perspective in terms of the complicated issues that you brought forward about this at the one time being potentially a therapy and a medicine, something spiritual. And you didn't even use the word recreational. But, you know, that's what a lot of folks, you know, who hear about psychedelics say, hey, I want to give that a try. And, you know, that may be somewhat therapeutic in a way, and maybe just for the fun of it.
Well, that survey research of quote unquote psychedelic users, most of them are recreational users. So the survey research, population work is asking them about their benefits. And there's some interesting studies, a bit more longitudinal, that maybe show a protective factor for mental health for psychedelic use at a young age. And by the way, back to our indigenous communities, psychedelic, well, the substances, ayahuasca in particular, is often used as a rite of passage into adulthood to make sure they're ready to join the community and to protect their environment and to work as a collective. So there's a lot of interesting things happening in the Amazonian context around prevention, not treatment.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask Pam to deliver your discussant remarks now. See if you can start off with some good questions for Brian.
Thank you, Rob. I'll do my best. And thank you for inviting me to be a discussant, because this is such a fascinating and complex area of work. And Brian, I think you've done like a fabulous job of giving us so much insight into what's happening. And it's a bit overwhelming if you're not immersed into this topic, and I haven't been. So forgive me if I stumble over things, but you know, there are some interesting insights that you know you've touched on that remind me of cannabis legislation and some of the work that we do in that area. I'm really pleased that you talk so much about the importance of distinguishing between the ritualistic use of psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy. As you said, psychedelic substances have been used by cultures around the world for thousands of years for ceremonial and healing purposes. And, you know, really our knowledge of psychedelics is so small compared to the traditional knowledge that is out there. And, you know, similar to the distinction that we make between commercial tobacco use and, you know, traditional or ceremonial tobacco use, it's really important to acknowledge that. So thank you. And I wondered, you know, you've done with the paper that I read, that your most recent paper on the work at the Takawasi Center, it seems like there was a lot of involvement of therapists and participants, a lot of qualitative work and involvement in the research itself. And I wondered, in terms of learning from traditional spiritual and ceremonial use of psychedelics, whether there's a movement in that area to actually involve people in the research itself.
Yeah, I guess involvement, one thing is to study people and involve them in the project. The other is to have them help develop your questions. I think in our project with the Takawasi Center, we benefited some from discussion with the traditional healers that are practicing there. The clients there come from all around the world, some local, but not necessarily indigenous. So they were not consulted, the clients themselves, as far as the research protocol. It was more tapping into the knowledge of the indigenous healers themselves. And what they had to say was really interesting, because see, if we were going to go there and conduct a clinical trial, or kind of our normal Western kind of research mindset, we want to disentangle things and say, well, what's the active ingredient here? if we want to learn from this center and take it somewhere else, like what's the active ingredient? And they just said, like, okay, so is it the medicine? Is it the music they sing, the Icaros? Is it the psychological integration that comes after, whatever? And they just said, that's a stupid question, sir. They just said, like, that's just, it's a holistic thing. The ceremonial aspect, that picture I showed you of a ceremony with the fire and the so on, there's a lot going on in that picture. So I think that's one thing that we learned from talking to them, was maybe the whole research question is just bullshit. And that's why I think the qualitative piece is so important. And yeah, we kind of organized the protocol to look for the most important things, but I don't think we'll find it. I think by the time we got into the project, we realized the question was maybe not the right question. It's the whole experience. And you know what, if I think about psychotherapy, or medication, it's also not about that. It's about the therapeutic relationship. It's about the race, gender, et cetera, of the therapist and the patient. It's, are you getting treated in a swanky clinic somewhere, or are you getting treated in a community health center in your neighborhood? All of these things impact healing. So I'm not sure it's so different there, but that's what we heard from them. The other thing, Pam, you touched on, and I'll just try to answer very briefly, is the importance of kind of the Indigenous perspective here. And we often get challenged, like, maybe this is just, you're bringing these medicines from somewhere else. It reminds people of colonialism. It reminds people of, oh, people brought stuff here before, look at the mess it's made. And the Indigenous people that are guiding some of our work, who are interested in bringing these medicines forward, say, no, we are not here to replace anything. We are here to accelerate your return to your traditional medicines. We are here to complement your traditional medicines, whether it's tobacco ceremony, pipe ceremony, land-based healing, sweat lodge, et cetera. So that's kind of where I'm at on that question around how do we incorporate these medicines into our Indigenous people here, because they have no direct experience, at least not within the last few centuries. So I found that comment interesting. And this is from a person who he's a traditional medicine man, and he managed finally to deal with his addictions. And then he returned to his traditional methods. So a very interesting story.
Really interesting. Thank you.
And don't worry about being a newcomer. I'm kind of a newcomer. If you ask, like, how did I get involved in all of this? It was like, I had an opportunity. I was invited to a ceremony, and I read a little bit before. They told me not to read too much, but I did. And I came away with what I still believe today. Something is going on here. Something is going on that can be of benefit to some people. It's not going to replace all of psychiatry and all of psychology, et cetera, but something is going on here. And exactly what it is, I think it's important that we find out.
That sort of segues into another question that I had around access. So equity and access to treatment, I think is an important piece. And from what I understand, psychedelic-assisted therapy really isn't covered by OHIP right now. I expect, and you talked about the sort of psychedelic tourism almost that's happening by people who have the means to do it. There's a lot of costs for costs of the treatment, but also costs of taking the time. I mean, from what I understand about some of the treatment, it involves a lot of, involves the access to a clinical or medical system, staying there for a period of time, having some follow-up and multiple visits. And I wondered, since marginalized people do have higher rates of mental health and substance disorders, how can we ensure that the treatment is accessible to the people who really need it?
That's a great question. And I'm happy you asked that. I think about this a lot. So let me answer first from the ceremonial aspect, kind of what's going on, I would agree with you. The average ayahuasca ceremony right now is $250 US a night. I don't know too many people, marginalized people can afford that. They are underground. There is an opportunity to join the Santo Daime religion churches, but they're not kind of everywhere, and it's maybe not everyone's cup of tea. So there's an equity challenge in the underground at the moment. Then from the point of view of what's coming, I see another problem. And that's the level of training that's required. So the training for being a psychedelic therapist is something like, I don't know, 200 hours on top of psychotherapy training. So be a regulated health professional and then top all of that up. So at the end of the day, the fee for accessing that therapist is going to be equivalent to accessing a psychologist now or higher. And we know psychology is not covered. A lot of psychotherapy is not covered. So I worry that unless somehow this gets incorporated into the health plans, which is going to be like another step whenever that happens, that we're creating a therapy that will in fact be out of reach for many, many people. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm really glad you raised that question, because I mean, when I went to a presentation by, he was one of the guys from the 60s who had done all this work, and he himself was a psychedelic trained therapist. He's from New York, and he was describing the training model, and I said, like, who's going to afford that? And there was no answer to that. Who's going to afford that? You're probably looking at, well, if you went to a psychologist now, if you don't have some kind of insurance, it's at least $250, $300 an hour, correct? So that's a very good question, Pam.
Right. Thank you,
Very
Brian, and thanks, Pam. Are you finished with your remarks?
It depends if I have more time or not.
Why don't we go over to Divya, and then Pam, maybe you can jump back in during the Q&A. Just want to make sure that Divya has her chance now as well.
Sounds
Thanks.
good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you, Dr. Brian. I think I'm just going to sum up your presentation and also kind of offer a few critical comments on what we discussed today. You gave us a rundown on the current state of research and the parallels that exist between marijuana regulation and psychedelics. There's also the interesting aspects on the spiritual and the ritualistic use. Even though science is moving ahead in this field, policy and regulation seems to be slow to catch up, causing a dissonance among researchers and policymakers. There seems to be a treatment gap in the area of mental health, and psychedelics seem to offer a promising option to fill that gap. But the limited research incentive and the push around using drugs to treat substance abuse shows that there is still stigma and perhaps fear among policymakers. We still see that in Canada and in some parts of the world, governments are still coming to terms with legalizing cannabis. Canada has shown the way in putting together a progressive policy with regards to cannabis use. Can that be an option that we can use for psychedelics use also? Right from the stage of production, distribution, and consumption, there is a viable system in place which has shown that perhaps this can also be replicated for other psychedelic substances. We already see that Canada's regulation has a reasonable levy on the use of psychedelics in the area of research and for compassionate use. What perhaps remains a hindrance towards a liberalized policy movement in this area is the normative issues around the use of psychedelics and the fear of overprescription that has been triggered with the latest opioid crisis in the US. This remains a challenge, and perhaps that needs to be addressed by supporters who want to bring in other psychedelic substances to wider use. To sum up, we are at a stage where there is a conversation in this field of research, especially also the spiritual side of things. And this shows that we are at a starting point of a new avenue in this field of study, which could bring a huge difference to mental health and public health at large. So these are my comments to sort of sum up your research and also open up for further questions. Thank you.
Wow,
let
Brian,
me,
as you're contemplating that, I'll just comment that I can just picture you as a journalist and giving a quick summary of something. That was quite fantastic.
I had the same feeling. Well, what a great summary. One thing that triggered for me as you were talking about, the research around kind of these spiritual things. In general, there's more interest in the healing aspects of yoga, of mindfulness, Buddhism, etc. So I think maybe part of the positive thing coming forward is that maybe it's not seen as all religious hocus pocus, that maybe it's a legitimate part of the study, because I've seen that. I'm a Kundalini yoga teacher trained in Kundalini yoga, and I've seen more research coming out on the benefits of yoga, and particularly around certain kind of mental functions. So.
Okay, great. So we're going to open up the Q&A. I see that Dina's already posed a question in the chat. Dina, did you want to vocalize that, or do you want me to read it out?
No, that's okay. I can read it. So I'm also a newcomer for this field. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I was just wondering if you think there should be a discussion, or in terms of public health consideration, of the long term of secondhand exposure to cannabis, for example, smoking marijuana.
Yeah, that's a bit out of my area of expertise. Maybe Pam and others, we've got experts here in the cannabis world. But
Pam, do you want to weigh in on that? This is actually something that you've thought about a lot.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, yeah, so we know that long-term secondhand smoke exposure of cannabis or tobacco. Well, we know for tobacco that it's harmful, and cannabis, the evidence is showing that it could also be very harmful to your lungs. I mean, you really shouldn't be breathing in anything that isn't oxygen and ambient air, but there have been movements towards protecting people from secondhand cannabis smoke. Most smoke-free laws include cannabis smoke now. So I think there is work being done in that area. And I think the big gap is multi-unit housing, where, for both smoking and cannabis is protected. But I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thanks, Pam, and thanks, Dina. I see 3 hands up right now. I'm not
Rob,
sure the order. Oh, Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, can I respond to Sandra's point earlier on before you go on? Around,
Certainly.
like it's in the chat. I just want, because it's an interesting point. Many people going to underground ceremony are dealing with some pretty significant challenges. And I get how many times people say, can you recommend a place, and which I don't. But they say, I have tried everything and I want to reset my brain. They said, I need a reset. So part of the public gestalt around this, if you will, is that psychedelics can help with that reset. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, Sandra. And it's a bit challenged to answer that, because we have examples of what Bill Miller, a well-respected addiction researcher, described many years ago as quantum change. And you might want to read up a little bit on that. He's a very well-respected addictions researcher. Quantum change, so that something just shifted, and my perspective shifted, or I didn't know I was dealing with that, and now I'm done with that. So you have this experience of pretty dramatic change, but it's not the norm. It's not the norm. And sometimes I think this kind of dramatic change gets overplayed, and people come into ceremony. So I'm coming to see God, or I'm coming to reset my brain and stuff. And I don't know, like, we don't have enough discussion about what's going on really in psychedelic-assisted therapy, because it's not it's not out there. But some people are looking for something because really nothing has worked. You can't imagine what it's like to get emails from folks dealing with treatment-resistant depression and almost begging you to find something that will work for me, or continual suicidal thought, and things like that. So anyway, I just wanted to respond to that, Sandra. It's a great question. It's something to worry a bit about, but on the other hand, you know, some people do have that experience. It's a tricky one.
Go ahead, Sandra, because I see that you've got a second question in the chat. So while you're on, go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, just to follow up with that too, I was curious if there's been any comparative studies on the effects of psychedelic drugs in therapy versus EMD, like other modalities like EMDR therapy.
I think the answer is no, but it'll come. But what we're seeing now is a shift in some of the psychedelic research of combining psychedelics with other things. So combining with CBT, or combining with mindfulness therapy, or combining with something. So I don't recall, and we just kind of did a pretty major review, and I can double check. I don't recall that specific study, but I think it will come once we get going mainstream.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm going to go to Leif, please. Leif.
Thank you very much for the presentation. And I just wanted to follow up on the questions presented by Dr. Kaufman. There were examples of indigenous plants and substances in the presentation, and I'm curious about the commodification of indigenous practices that remove it really out of indigenous cultural and spiritual context into this medicalized paradigm. And are indigenous ways of knowing being used to guide policy and this medicalization processes, especially because you brought up, you know, like the spiritual context where these plants originated from, but as well the consideration of this transcendental hypothesis. And in further to this comment about the spiritual component, is this culturally specific? So we talk about churches and spiritual practices, like the example of ayahuasca coming from South America. So what does it mean to import and use those practices here in like indigenous communities that are actually rooted in North America, where that plant is not native to? So I wanted to ask if you could speak more to this process of colonialization and extractive medicalization of indigenous knowledge. And is there reciprocal relationships, and are indigenous peoples benefiting from this research when we see, for example, like psychedelic tourism? Who can afford that versus like the indigenous crisis and mental health crisis that we are facing here?
That's about 4 questions. So good, Leif. You give that guy a big score, Rob. Seriously, those are very good questions. Let me speak to the commodification, the colonization of these plants. There's a lot of people very interested in that. I'm not an expert in that. One thing I will say is there's a tremendous generosity in indigenous people, in particular in the Amazonian context, if in fact there's a giving back, if there's a sense of reciprocity. So I think to me, that's the key. What are we giving back? And somebody told me the other day, how do you recognize kind of a good shaman? And it's, or a good, if people are doing these ceremonies and inviting foreigners, paying an awful lot of money, what's the key to identifying a good one? And the person told me there should be a community project behind it. There should be, you know, something building capacity in the community, whether it's schools, or whether it's construction, or whether it's forest preservation or something like that. So it's a very, very complex question, Leif, but I think from my point of view, the reciprocity piece is one thing that's that I just kind of live by personally. And the other is like this question about bringing medicine here that's not from somewhere else. I participated recently. It was a new project evolving this time in Mexico. I was there about a month ago, and the project was being organized for the Yaqui people in the Sonora Desert in Mexico, which have suffered tremendously and horrendous crystal meth at the moment. And they brought a healing group from the Amazonian jungle, the Huni Quinn people. So they brought medicine from somewhere else. And it's part of a longer term program, 3-month program, gradually bringing them back to their traditional peyote ceremonies. And the feedback, so there was clients in the circle, and we were all up in the morning and doing a talking circle. And some of them says, this is the first time I've ever felt like an Indian. And it was medicine from somewhere else that brought them to that. So I don't think in principle, it's a problem sharing medicines interculturally. If it's done in the right spirit and the right preparation and the right objectives, and with a lot of support and discussion. Going to a one-off ceremony is not the way to go. These folks were in a 3-month treatment program. But I think in principle, I've kind of seen it work, this intercultural exchange of healing, of medicine, because Indigenous peoples are not governed by any particular boundary that we've placed on them. And I've talked to Indigenous scholars, Indigenous healers, medicine men who know, they understand in their way of knowing the centuries old pathways of communication between the Amazonian people and our people here in Canada. So to say the medicines are not from here, well, that's already kind of a colonial way of looking at it. So really good questions, Leith. Really appreciate it, especially in the commodification, like peyote is disappearing. The DMT toad in the Sonora is disappearing. You know, the people running ceremony, even the traditional healers in Peru, are going deeper and deeper into the jungle to harvest ayahuasca. So there's a real impact on our environment that we need to be paying particular attention to. There's no question about that.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks, Lee, for those questions. Ari Franklin?
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Brian. That was a really interesting presentation. I have a question for you just about the clinical trials that are going on right now. So you highlighted that, one of the challenges about moving policy forward for the regulators is having strong research evidence. And for the phase 3 and phase 4 trials, obviously, they're really needed. But I was kind of curious about your thoughts on this one point that last week there was a neurologist at CAMH who did a grand rounds about placebos. And in the context of psychedelic trials, one of the challenges, of course, is blinding, right? Like you'll have MDMA trials where 90% of people can identify they're getting the active drug. So I was kind of curious about if we really care about set and setting with the effects of this and the selection bias of who's currently using, these medicines and different drugs, like in ritualistic context, but also just underground and for personal use. I'm kind of curious if that's going to be a big challenge, is being able to show how effective they can be for a widespread use for many types of people if we can't control for placebos that well.
I think that's there's a possibility that could stop the whole thing. You can't. I can tell you from personal experience, like I don't know anybody who could be on ayahuasca and not know it, or LSD or psilocybin, etc. And it reminds me of the presentation that Ed Sellers made at this conference. He started by saying, "This is impossible. What the problem you present is simply impossible to do a blinded or whatever double-blinded controlled trial." And so he was supporting the direction of this pharmaceutical company for just quote unquote kind of harvesting the psychological benefit without hallucination and without that level of dosage. That's the direction that entire company is going, because they think that may in fact be the only way to approval. I don't know. I think it's really a big challenge. And in the circles I travel, I have everyone from, I won't name names, but head of research for a major research center saying, we don't know anything. This is going way too fast, and really putting the brakes on the enthusiasm for reasons, one of which you described, Ari. And then all the way to others saying, look at the weight of the evidence here. Look, let's just get going. Let's move into like phase 3, phase 4, whatever. But I don't know how we're ever going to deal with the placebo question. I really don't.
Yeah, it's a challenge because I was talking to some people in industry recently on the other side, right? And exactly, they want to move so fast, which on one hand is great, right? Of course, to get as many people interested in moving, but yeah, it seems much faster than solving that problem. So it's good to hear your point of view that is an issue to be addressed.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Ingrid, thank you for your patience. Your turn.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for sharing the landscapes in your presentation earlier. This is an area that I'm also very unfamiliar with, so it was nice to sort of get an overview of what's been happening and where it's at. I think my question really ties in with Leif's earlier question, and I'm hoping it doesn't fully overlap. But I wondered if you could expand on some of the ethical considerations around the commercial partnerships that would ultimately come with legal regulation, especially in the context of substances that are used by Indigenous peoples, and how it may differentially impact both the access and modality for those.
I don't know how to keep industry out, except out of my own life. That's easy, just say no. I don't know how to keep them out. And they're really in deep. I'll give you one example. One of the companies that contacted me said they basically described it as pharmawaska. They wanted to take the active ingredients in ayahuasca, put it in a pill, and then pull out the key ingredients of an ayahuasca ceremony and put it into a global network of healing centers. It was just such the wrong thing to do. It was just such the wrong thing to do. Number one, putting the medicine in a pill, and number two, pirating ceremonial aspects and developing centers around the world. This was such a bad idea. And the other thing that really turned me off, by the way, there was two of them, and one guy didn't even turn his camera on. So like, you expect to do business with a guy that you can't even show their face. That's just personal. I don't know. I have a really good answer. The industry's there. There's good people in industry. There are many people are well-minded, and how we take some of these medicines, in particular ayahuasca or peyote. Well, peyote is already kind of synthesized in mescaline. Mushrooms already gone pretty far, hasn't it, in terms of manufacture. So how do we return to the Indigenous people? I don't know. I think you just have to do it one-on-one. For me right now, it's just kind of projects that I engage in. My commitment going forward is working with Indigenous people and following the OCAP principles, and work in training Indigenous scholars and training young Indigenous scientists to work in this area. I think is another really important way. And then doing our best to get well-minded people in quote unquote industry interested in also supporting Indigenous people, returning money back, supporting communities, having community projects. There are some in the United States that are, taking a portion of profit and or using their corporate profits in a way that's returning. There's a fund been established in the States from some pretty big, super rich people, and they're pooling their money together to provide a common fund for research with Indigenous people. So this was one good step forward. So they've been supporting psychedelic work for quite some time, but now they've decided to pool their money and create a common fund for supporting Indigenous people, Indigenous communities. So if there are good people out there, it's not all bad, but it's like I said, when I went to the opening of the Nikian Center, and I've been supporting the center in the background, it's a great development. I was looking around at the crowd, and it was a very interesting crowd. There's clinical people there. There was young neuroscience guys there that I met. And then there looked like a lot of startups. Looked like a lot of people with shiny shoes and swanky belts. That's all I'm saying.
It's a bit overwhelming. All of the things that are happening and may be happening, especially once the commercial interests get heavily involved. And with that, Indigenous lands, it's a challenge. But Brian, it's good to hear about some of the good things as well. Yeah. Cassandra, please go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank
so
you so
Sandra's
much.
got a good question.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for that. Yeah, that's one of my questions. I also have another one, which maybe you can touch on first. So I'm doing my MSc right now at the University of Toronto. I was part of this public health policy collaboration last year. And I'm also a yoga teacher. And so I teach different forms of yoga, and psychedelics is quite popular among the yoga community. And I've done quite a bit of research in breath work and pranayama and ancient breath work healing modalities. And that's something I guide. And I found that just psychobiology, in the brain, there's a similar thing happening when people do different forms of breath work, similarly to using psychedelics. And so there might be a potential there for people that are perhaps, hesitant to use psychedelics, or, there's a lot of people that are afraid to work with these different medicines.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you've, read on anything about that, or if there's anything happening in that field.
A couple of things come to mind. One is some of the training programs to be a psychedelic-assisted therapist include experience with, I think it's holotropic, is the right word, breath work, because it will induce an altered state of consciousness. So I think the effects are, I've not tried myself, but I think the effects are purported to be quite similar in terms of shifting a level of consciousness. So maybe some people might think of that as a bit safer, but they might get to the same place anyway and maybe not feel so safe. So it might feel better because I'm not ingesting something, but they might still be, quite anxious or not sure what the outcome will be. The other thing is, I remember reading a while back about the connection between all these substances and kind of art and religion, kind of among the cavemen, so to speak, the Neanderthals, like way back. And the question came up as, well, how can there be these cave drawings, whether the cave drawings were inspired by psychedelic mushrooms or whatever, how can there be all these cave drawings in parts of the world where there are no psychedelic mushrooms or plants? And the answers seem to be dance, kind of dance to the point of an altered state of consciousness. So I think there's many different ways to get there. And some of the yogis, as you know, would say that they get there through meditation. I often look at these substances maybe as a bit of a rocket ship to get you somewhere. That the training that both you and I have done on meditation is not so easy, and it's a long process, and I'm far from there myself. But I think there's a variety of ways to get to an altered state of consciousness, and some of the ones that you described may take longer, but might be healthier for some people, like who just can't handle that kind of really immediate impact on the brain. It's powerful experiences.
Yeah.
Your other question, if you don't mind, Cassandra, around where to go for treatment, we'll see. I think the center at UHN is going to go pretty quickly as far as putting in applications for research. We really are waiting for CIHR to kind of see where they stand on all of this. And it's looking good that they will put out a call. What they'll prioritize, I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if they prioritize treatment-resistant depression as one of the priorities, because we really don't have much to offer. And so you may find the center here in Toronto getting active in that area. They're already starting to develop their policies. You could reach out, the person's name is Emma Hapke, Hapke, to see what they're interested in, or you could just wait a little bit. They really just got going.
And Emma
the other centers interested in PTSD, it will grow, because there's also, like not a lot. And I wouldn't be surprised if we find some of the first work approved in veterans and first responders, because there's really not too much to offer there for PTSD.
Yeah, because I work with a lot of like yoga clients of mine that have treatment-resistant depression, even PTSD. or both. And they're, yeah, a lot of them are interested in participating in any research. So, yeah.
Well, there's a lot of, won't get in too deep here, but there's a lot of desperation out there, especially around treatment-resistant depression and suicidal, thought, and also parents reaching out for support for their children. So it's hard not to get caught up sometimes in the personal stories when you put yourself out in the field like this, and then you become a magnet for people looking for help, and you just have to do your best. And you're in that situation too as a yoga teacher.
Thank you.
Thanks. We are running short on time. There's one more question, well, now maybe two, in the chat. Felix is asking, I don't know if you want to unmute, Felix?
Sure. Hi, Dr. Rush. Thanks for the presentation.
Hi,
this might be more of a commentary because it was kind of touched on by Leif and Ingrid, but I guess I just wanted to ask about your thoughts on incorporating maybe a vulnerable population approach in terms of prioritizing access to communities that have been disproportionately affected by criminalization in the past during the anti-war on drugs, and also Indigenous communities. And also you mentioned some of the ecological constraints in terms of the supply of psilocybin and all of the entheogens, but also, just kind of the underrumblings of all the industry interest and the fact that, the commodity is kind of rare, or like the access to it is not widespread. So I see a lot of ethical challenges, and I see a lot of maybe like the intentions to roll it out to impact certain communities. I see some like a gap in terms of how you're able to reach those communities when most people who can use this are either the traditional communities or people who have the means and who might be the first to kind of get the most benefit because they have the money to access expensive.
I think, there are good researchers amongst us who are very committed to working with marginalized populations. Monica Williams, for one, who's the New Canada Research Chair at the Ottawa Centre. Her whole career has been built around equity. And I also think of the folks at the British Columbia Centre on Substance Use that are, the story in the downtown east side, and some of the work that they were doing, some of the community health work was with sex workers and the impact of these substances on reducing suicidality. So there are researchers amongst us that I think will continue to shine a light on the marginalized, while at the same time industry will be looking for a market, and it's going to be much broader than that. And then I guess just from my own, you'll find researchers who maybe prioritize like I have now. I'm happy to support other people doing clinical trials, and that for my own work, I just want to work with Indigenous populations and return something back, especially at this stage in my career. But
okay. Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Felix, for the question. And thanks everybody who's participated with really insightful questions. I see there's some chat about yoga and some references there for people who are interested. From a policy perspective, I find this so fascinating because do you follow the cannabis route where you first legalize medical psychedelics for treatment? Do you then more broadly legalize or decriminalize psychedelics? What are the problems out there right now that we're trying to solve? And what's as we learned from Yanni, those of us in CHL 5300, what's the problem represented to be right now? And certainly the industry interests are presenting problems in one way, Indigenous folks in a different way. Those interested in helping people suffering from severe or less severe mental health issues in a different way. And from a policy perspective, what framing of the problem is going to come to the top, and how to move. And without the evidence, the evidence may be impossible to bring about for the therapeutics. I'm kind of glad I'm not the policymaker, but Brian, last word to you.
I don't know. I'm not even sure where the question was in there, if there was one, but I think everybody just has to find some way that they can contribute personally. And for me, I think I found it a bit being kind of a helper on other people's work and focusing on Indigenous, and also just in your personal life. When people ask if this can be helpful, be a little bit cautious and do your reading, and it does help an awful lot of people, maybe even people on this call. So what we do, I'm glad I'm not a policymaker either right now, and I don't know where they will land. Maybe they start with something that everybody kind of gets, and that's around end of life distress. Like, we're all going to have end of life, like, let's face it. We're not all going to have treatment resistant depression, etc. But maybe they'll pick something like that. I don't know, Rob, I don't think I'm answering your question very well. It's
No, it was not really a question. It's just
yeah, I don't know.
Thinking about what's the best way, what are the best policy routes to go. I don't think there's an answer, and just to phrase it for us to all think about as we end.
Maybe a good way to end up is remain cautiously optimistic about the research. The questions around placebo, et cetera, I think it's good to remain cautiously optimistic, but we're not there yet. So hopefully, I mean, some would argue that the whole cannabis thing went a little bit too quickly, and now a lot of stuff's coming up, right? So it's be cautiously optimistic. I would say retain a spiritual aspect to your own life would help you recognize the spiritual aspects of this type of work. So, think of that dimension of your life, biopsychosocial, spiritual, and then be open to whatever this brings us as the field evolves. But those would be my last two parting words.
Thank you so very much for coming today and for opening our eyes to the many potentials, the challenges, and explaining where we're at right now. So many lenses on this. Thanks, Pam, for your insights. Thank Divya for your insights. And thanks to everybody who participated today. We are having an institute for those in the training program on the legalization of drugs more generally. There are some connections between the two things, and looking forward to lots more conversations. Rounds will resume in January.
Thanks again, Robert. Our conference will be both face-to-face and virtual, so people can maybe participate in different ways. So thanks again, Pam. It was so nice to see you. Thanks for participating today, and everybody have a great weekend. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. And thanks, Sonia, once again for organizing everything.
Thanks.